Title: GDP measures throughput. Civilization advances by reducing friction. Summary statement: GDP tells us how much economic activity passes through the machine. It does not tell us how difficult the machine is to use. A society can generate enormous throughput while burying citizens beneath bureaucracy, intermediaries, delays, fees, and dependencies. Conversely, simplification, automation, disintermediation, and friction reduction often improve real-world outcomes while reducing measurable activity. Rather than replacing GDP, societies should pair it with a simplicity index that measures friction reduction. GDP asks, how much activity occurred? The simplicity index asks, how easy is it to accomplish useful things? Together, they provide a more complete picture of economic health. Introduction: the measurement problem. Gross domestic product is one of the most influential statistics in modern economic life. Governments target it, central banks monitor it, investors react to it, news organizations report it as a shorthand measure of national success. When GDP rises, policymakers celebrate. When GDP falls, alarm bells ring. Yet GDP was never designed to measure prosperity in its broadest sense. Developed during the 20th century and refined through the work of economists such as Simon Kuznets, GDP was intended to measure market-valued production, the value of final goods and services produced within an economy during a given period. It was a tool for understanding economic activity, particularly during periods of crisis such as the Great Depression and World War II. Its strength is clarity. GDP answers a straightforward question: how much economic activity occurred? What GDP does not answer is equally important. It does not directly measure resilience, efficiency, simplicity, sustainability, quality of life, institutional effectiveness, or the ease with which citizens and businesses can accomplish useful things. This distinction has become increasingly important in a world shaped by automation, digital infrastructure, artificial intelligence, and global supply chains. Many of the most valuable innovations of the modern era have shared a common characteristic: they reduced friction. Email reduced the friction of communication. Online banking reduced the friction of payments. Cloud computing reduced the friction of deploying software. Broadband reduced the friction of accessing information. Automation reduces the friction of repetitive work. Yet friction reduction often removes intermediaries, compresses processes, eliminates transactions, and simplifies systems. In some cases, these improvements can reduce measured economic activity, even while increasing real-world utility. This creates a tension that sits at the center of modern economic measurement. GDP measures throughput. Civilization often advances through simplification. The two concepts are related, but they are not the same. Section 1. GDP, the throughput machine. GDP is best understood as a measure of throughput. Like a flow meter attached to a large industrial machine, GDP records the volume of economic activity passing through the system. Using the expenditure approach, GDP is commonly calculated by adding together consumption plus investment plus government spending plus net exports. Each component captures a different source of economic activity, but the underlying principle remains the same. GDP records production and expenditure that can be observed and valued in market terms. This framework provides extraordinary usefulness. GDP allows economists to compare countries, evaluate business cycles, estimate tax capacity, and assess debt sustainability. Without a common metric, economic planning would become far more difficult. The problem emerges when GDP is treated as a comprehensive measure of progress. Consider a simple example. Suppose two countries produce the same final outcome. In country A, a process requires 10 approvals, multiple consultants, several administrative reviews, and numerous service providers. In country B, technology has reduced the process to a handful of automated steps. The final result is identical. The path is not. Country A generates more invoices, more billable hours, more administrative services, and more recorded economic activity. Country B generates less. GDP is highly effective at measuring the activity created by these processes. It is far less effective at evaluating whether those processes were necessary in the first place. This distinction becomes clearer when viewed through the lens of productivity. Productivity measures how much output can be produced with a given amount of labor, capital, energy, or time. Historically, rising productivity has been one of the primary drivers of improved living standards. The Industrial Revolution increased productivity. Electrification increased productivity. Containerization increased productivity. Computers increased productivity. The internet increased productivity. In nearly every case, the breakthrough involved reducing friction somewhere within the system. Fewer inputs, less time, less labor, less complexity. The objective was not to maximize activity. The objective was to achieve the same outcome more efficiently. This is where GDP's limitations become visible. GDP measures how much work the machine performs. It does not necessarily measure how difficult the machine is to use. Section 2. The friction blind spot. If GDP measures throughput, what exactly is friction? In engineering, friction is resistance to motion. In economics, friction can be understood as resistance to productive activity. It is the collection of obstacles, delays, dependencies, procedures, and transaction costs that separate intention from execution. Economic friction appears in many forms. Bureaucratic friction, the permits, forms, approvals, and administrative procedures required to complete a task. Transactional friction, the fees, intermediaries, and processing layers inserted between parties attempting to exchange value. Latency friction, the time required to move from decision to execution. Dependency friction, reliance upon external systems, suppliers, jurisdictions, or geopolitical relationships that introduce vulnerability and delay. Unlike GDP, friction is experienced directly by citizens. Entrepreneurs experience it when launching a company. Homeowners experience it when seeking permits. Businesses experience it when importing goods. Investors experience it when navigating regulatory frameworks. The challenge is that friction is often invisible in traditional economic statistics. Indeed, some forms of friction can increase measured economic activity. Every additional approval may require staff. Every intermediary may collect fees. Every compliance requirement may support consultants, auditors, lawyers, or administrators. These activities are visible to GDP. The burden imposed upon the citizen often is not. As a result, two economies can generate similar levels of measured activity while presenting radically different experiences to the people operating within them. This observation does not imply that all regulation is wasteful or that all complexity is harmful. Many forms of complexity provide genuine value. Financial audits improve trust, safety inspections reduce risk, legal systems facilitate commerce. The objective is not the elimination of complexity. The objective is the identification and reduction of unnecessary friction. That distinction is critical. The question is not, how much activity exists? The question is, how much resistance exists between a useful objective and its completion? That question opens a different lens through which to evaluate economic performance. And it is through that lens that some of the most revealing modern examples begin to emerge. Section 3. When more activity does not mean more progress. One of the most persistent assumptions in modern economic thinking is that more activity automatically implies more progress. In many cases, this assumption holds. More factories, more trade, more investment, and more innovation often coincide with rising living standards. However, activity and progress are not identical concepts. A system can generate substantial economic activity while simultaneously imposing significant friction on its participants. This becomes particularly visible in sectors where complexity accumulates over time. U.S. Healthcare Administration. The United States spends more on healthcare than any other advanced economy. Total healthcare expenditure is approximately 17 to 18% of GDP, substantially higher than most OECD peers. Yet a meaningful portion of this spending is not directed toward medical treatment itself. It is directed toward administration. Multiple insurance providers, claims processing systems, billing specialists, compliance departments, coding requirements, reimbursement negotiations, and eligibility verification systems create layers of administrative activity. Studies have estimated administrative costs at roughly 7.6 to 8% of total U.S. healthcare spending, compared with approximately 3 to 4% in many comparable countries. From a GDP perspective, these activities generate measurable output. Employees receive salaries, consultants provide services, software vendors sell systems, claims processors perform work, economic activity occurs. From the patient's perspective, however, much of this activity represents friction. The objective is healthcare. The complexity exists between the patient and that objective. This illustrates a central theme. activity can increase while usefulness remains unchanged. Or in some cases, activity can increase while usefulness declines. Payment networks and transaction layers. A similar pattern appears in modern payment systems. Cash transactions represent a relatively direct exchange. Person A transfers value to person B. The transaction is complete. Digital payment systems introduce additional layers: issuing banks, acquiring banks, payment processors, card networks, settlement providers, compliance systems. These layers provide valuable services, including fraud protection, convenience, and global interoperability. Yet they also generate measurable economic activity through fees and processing charges. In the United States, total card processing and interchange fees exceeded approximately $187 billion in 2024, according to industry estimates. These fees support employment, infrastructure, software platforms, and financial institutions. GDP records these activities. The user experiences the associated costs and dependencies. The observation is not that payment networks are undesirable. Rather, it demonstrates that additional layers often increase measured economic activity even when the underlying objective remains unchanged, moving value from one party to another. The hidden difference between movement and accomplishment. These examples reveal an important distinction. GDP is highly effective at measuring movement within a system. What it measures less effectively is accomplishment. Two systems can produce identical outcomes. One may require 10 intermediaries, 20 approvals, and 30 transactions. The other may require one platform, one approval, and one transaction. GDP may record more activity in the first system. Most participants would prefer the second. This observation does not invalidate GDP. It simply highlights the difference between measuring movement and measuring accomplishment. Section 4. The compression effect. If friction creates activity, then simplification often creates the opposite effect. This process can be described as compression. Compression occurs when technology, organization, or process improvements reduce the number of steps required to achieve a desired outcome. Historically, many of the most important innovations have been compression technologies. Containerization compressed global shipping. The Internet compressed communication. Search engines compressed information discovery. Automation compresses labor requirements. Artificial intelligence compresses cognitive workflows. The common characteristic is straightforward: fewer steps, less time, lower cost, better outcomes. Yet compression often reduces measurable activity in the process. This content is brought to you by Bobby Giggs. Promote your brand here and reach a wide audience across platforms like YouTube, Instagram, and Facebook. Follow the links in the description to get started. Direct-to-consumer models. The rise of direct-to-consumer businesses provides a useful example. Traditional retail systems often involve manufacturer, distributor, wholesaler, retailer, consumer. Each layer performs a function. Each layer also captures a margin. Each layer contributes to economic activity. Companies such as Dell pioneered direct sales models that bypassed significant portions of traditional distribution networks. Tesla adopted a similar approach through direct sales and company-owned distribution channels. The result was fewer intermediaries between producer and customer. This reduced costs and improved responsiveness. It also compressed portions of the value chain that previously generated activity and revenue. Again, the final outcome remained the same. A product reached a customer. The pathway became shorter. Automation and artificial intelligence. Automation represents an even more powerful form of compression. When a software system automates a task previously performed by 10 employees, several things occur simultaneously. Productivity rises, costs decline, speed increases, consistency often improves. At the same time, fewer labor hours are required. Certain forms of economic activity disappear. This creates an apparent contradiction. The system becomes more efficient. Yet some categories of measurable activity shrink. The same pattern can be observed in customer service, accounting, logistics, software development, and increasingly knowledge work. The objective remains unchanged. The route becomes shorter. Supply chain compression. Supply chains provide another useful lens. Historically, complex supply chains evolved because communication was slow, information was fragmented, and coordination costs were high. Digital systems have changed those constraints. Modern firms increasingly seek shorter supply chains, fewer intermediaries, greater visibility, reduced inventory requirements, faster decision-making. Compression improves responsiveness and lowers costs. However, each intermediary removed also removes a layer of economic activity. The result is a recurring theme throughout economic history. Simplification often reduces measured activity while increasing real-world efficiency. Section 5. Company registration as a measure of economic friction. Among all possible examples, company registration may be one of the clearest measures of economic friction. Unlike many abstract economic concepts, registration processes are directly observable. They can be timed, they can be counted, they can be compared. For entrepreneurs, company formation represents the transition from idea to execution. The longer that transition takes, the greater the friction imposed by the system. Singapore provides one of the world's strongest examples of a low-friction environment. Through the Accounting and Corporate Regulatory Authority's BizFile Plus platform, straightforward business registrations can often be completed within one day. The process is highly digitalized. Physical visits are largely unnecessary. Procedures are limited. Costs are predictable. The system is designed around speed and clarity. By contrast, many developing economies continue to require multiple offices, paper documentation, sequential approvals, and lengthy waiting periods. In some jurisdictions, registration can require weeks or even months. The economic implications extend beyond inconvenience. Delays slow capital formation. Delays discourage entrepreneurship. Delays increase costs. Delays favor incumbents. Most importantly, delays represent friction. GDP largely ignores this distinction. The entrepreneur does not. The investor does not. The business owner does not. From their perspective, the question is not, how much activity occurred? It is, how difficult was it to begin creating value? This may ultimately point toward one of the most practical components of a future simplicity index. Because unlike many economic debates, friction can often be measured directly. Days, approvals, procedures, waiting times, and administrative steps. They reveal how easy it is to participate in the economy itself. That difference is often where progress occurs. Section 6. Broadband and the shift from usage optimization to outcome optimization. Perhaps the clearest illustration of friction reduction comes not from economics, but from telecommunications. For much of the 20th century, telephone networks operated on a metered model. Users paid based on call duration, distance, and usage volume. Long-distance calls were often expensive. International calls were even more costly. As a result, people optimized their behavior around the meter. Conversations were shortened. Calls were planned. Usage was rationed. The infrastructure remained highly visible because every interaction carried an incremental cost. Broadband fundamentally changed that relationship. Instead of charging per minute or per action, providers increasingly shifted toward flat rate, always-on connectivity. The user no longer asked, "How many minutes do I have left?" The user asked, "What can I accomplish?" This transition dramatically reduced friction. The infrastructure faded into the background. People spent less time managing usage and more time creating value. The result was an explosion of digital commerce, online education, content creation, software development, remote collaboration, and information exchange. Numerous studies have linked broadband adoption to measurable increases in productivity and economic growth. Yet the deeper significance extends beyond GDP. Broadband changed the mental model. It shifted society from optimizing usage to optimizing outcomes. This distinction mirrors the broader argument of this essay. Complex systems often require participants to devote energy toward navigating the system itself. Simplified systems allow participants to focus on their objectives. That difference is often where progress occurs. Section 7. Energy, resilience, and dependency. Energy systems provide another perspective on the relationship between throughput and friction. Traditional fossil fuel systems rely upon extensive networks of extraction, refining, transportation, financing, insurance, storage, and geopolitical coordination. These systems are extraordinarily productive. They are also highly interconnected. Oil produced in one region may be refined in another, shipped through strategic choke points, financed by global institutions, and consumed thousands of miles away. The resulting network generates substantial economic activity. However, it also creates dependencies. Events such as the Russia-Ukraine conflict, disruptions in the Red Sea, concerns surrounding the Strait of Hormuz, and broader geopolitical tensions have highlighted the vulnerabilities embedded within highly interconnected energy systems. In response, many countries have pursued greater energy diversification and domestic generation capacity. Renewable energy, distributed generation, battery storage, and microgrids are often motivated by more than environmental concerns. They also reduce dependency friction. The objective is not merely energy production. The objective is reliable energy production with fewer external vulnerabilities. This creates an important distinction. A nation may improve resilience by reducing dependencies, yet some of the associated economic activity may decline as imports, intermediaries, or external services become less necessary. GDP captures the activity. Resilience captures the outcome. The two are related but not identical. This observation reinforces a recurring theme throughout this discussion. Not every reduction in activity represents a reduction in progress. Sometimes it represents the removal of unnecessary dependency. Section 8. DOGE and the politics of simplification. Attempts to simplify systems often encounter resistance. The Department of Government Efficiency, commonly known as DOGE, provides a recent and highly visible example. Announced following the 2024 U.S. presidential election, DOGE was initially associated with Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy and was tasked with identifying waste, fraud, abuse, and inefficiency across federal operations. Public targets evolved over time. Early discussions referenced potential savings measured in trillions of dollars. Subsequent estimates became more modest as practical constraints emerged. Regardless of the precise figures involved, the initiative revealed an important dynamic. Every expenditure within a large system supports constituencies. Contracts support vendors. Programs support employees. Grants support organizations. Agencies support local economies. Consequently, efforts to remove spending frequently generate opposition. The resistance does not necessarily arise because the spending is efficient, nor does it necessarily arise because the spending is inefficient. Rather, complexity develops stakeholders. Those stakeholders often defend the existing structure. This observation extends well beyond government. The same pattern appears in healthcare administration, regulatory systems, financial intermediation, supply chains, and corporate hierarchies. Complexity frequently acquires defenders. Simplification therefore becomes both a technical challenge and a political challenge. The lesson is not that all complexity should be eliminated. The lesson is that friction reduction often encounters institutional resistance precisely because existing structures create measurable activity and vested interests. Section 9. Beyond GDP, the case for a simplicity index. The evidence presented throughout this discussion does not suggest that GDP should be abandoned. GDP remains one of the most useful economic indicators ever developed. It provides a common language for comparing economies, evaluating growth, and assessing economic capacity. The problem is not GDP itself. The problem is treating GDP as the sole measure of success. GDP answers one question exceptionally well: how much economic activity occurred? It does not answer another increasingly important question: how easy is it to accomplish useful things? This is where a complementary metric becomes valuable. A simplicity index would not replace GDP. It would measure a different dimension of economic reality. Potential components could include business registration time, permitting delays, contract enforcement time, customs clearance speed, tax filing complexity, payment settlement latency, energy connection timelines, and regulatory burden. Unlike GDP, these measures focus on friction. They assess how much resistance exists between intention and execution. Such an index would allow policymakers to evaluate whether economies are becoming easier or harder to navigate. The goal would not be maximum simplification at all costs. Complex systems sometimes provide valuable safeguards, redundancy, and resilience. The objective would instead be the reduction of unnecessary friction. In this framework, GDP and the Simplicity Index become complementary. GDP measures throughput. The Simplicity Index measures friction reduction. Together, they provide a more complete picture of economic performance. Conclusion: a better way to measure progress. Economic activity matters. Production matters. Investment matters. Trade matters. GDP remains an indispensable tool for measuring these realities. Yet the modern economy increasingly demonstrates that activity alone is not the same as progress. Many of the most transformative innovations of the past century succeeded because they reduced friction. They shortened processes. They removed intermediaries. They compressed supply chains. They automated repetitive work. They reduced dependency. They allowed individuals and organizations to accomplish more with less effort. These gains are real, even when they are not fully visible through conventional measures of throughput. The challenge, therefore, is not to replace GDP. It is to complement it. GDP measures how much economic activity passes through the machine. A simplicity index would measure how difficult the machine is to use. GDP asks how much activity occurred. The simplicity index asks how easy is it to accomplish useful things. Those are different questions. Both matter. And in an increasingly complex world, measuring both may provide a clearer understanding of what genuine economic progress actually looks like.